I've been running this channel just over 3 years now, and I've noticed a pattern. Every winter we get a few weeks where it's impossible to get my filming done because of the weather. Now, the hard facts are my camera equipment is expensive and I can't risk taking it out in very wet, very windy weather. It tends not to stay upright on a tripod for very long. And so I have to get inventive with that week's videos. Now, this isn't a major problem because I have literally hundreds of hours of B-roll squirreled away on my hard drive, laying in wait for just such an occasion, and that's what you're watching now. Footage from my BMW riding days. These last 2 weeks have, for me, been quite significant weather-wise for a number of reasons. In my head, I just see this as being the normal winter weather that I've experienced all my life. It's no different, windy, wet, sometimes quite destructive. It's just one of those things. But amidst this bad weather over the last 2 weeks, there have been two notable differences. One is that Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, has announced that at the next UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, which is going to be held in November, he's going to be bringing forward the deadline for zero emissions motor vehicles in the UK. And he's not the only one. America are doing it, and so is most of Europe. Probably countries like Australia and New Zealand will fall in line as well. I think there are only parts of Asia, India and China being two notable countries which won't get involved with it at all. Now, I think it was last year that they announced that all motor vehicles sold in Britain and other participating countries had to be zero emissions vehicles by 2040, which basically means they have to be electrically powered. And now, around about a year later, that's been moved forward to 2035, which is only 15 years away. But there are already rumours coming from governmental sources that this may be moved again to as early as 2030. That's only 10 years from now. It seems to me that they're sort of feeding it to us in bits. But the timescale of the agenda that they have in mind is actually far tighter than we were originally led to believe. Basically what it looks as though they're doing, they've started off a game and now they've got people running around moving the goalposts every few minutes. Something that we're all quite used to. Now, when the 2040 deadline was announced last year, it didn't worry me too much because I just thought, well, you know, we'll all get electric bikes and electric bikes are going to be just as much fun as petrol-driven bikes. Besides which, I'm probably going to be at the end of my riding days by then, and motorcycles will still be around for a while, second-hand ones. It's no great shakes to me, it's not going to affect me that badly. But now they've moved it forward 5 years with an underlying threat that it's probably going to be moved forward a further 5 years. And I'll get into that and how I think it's going to affect us motorcyclists in a few minutes, but first this. This is all aimed at halting climate change, global warming. You know, the justification that they're giving to us for doing this, for taking petrol-driven vehicles away from us, is that once these petrol-driven vehicles have all gone, the Earth is going to return to how it was before and all is going to be good. But is it? Really? I don't think it will be. The purpose of this video is not to force my views about global warming on anybody, because to be quite honest, I'm confused as hell about the whole thing. None of it seems to fit. In fact, I think the reason I'm making this video is to get other people's views on it all. Because when you look into it and try and sort the wheat from the chaff, all that is really in the basket is chaff. There is no wheat. We're all led to believe that the weather is getting worse and worse year on year. But as I look back at over 5 decades of weather that I've experienced in my life, I don't see anything being significantly different from before. Yes, we've got the scientists and the politicians banging away at us that global warming is a real thing, it's our fault and we need to halt it. And we've also got the global media jumping on the bandwagon every time we have a bit of weather and basically just over-reporting the hell out of it. And that's the second thing that's grabbed my attention in the last 2 weeks. in the old days, the weatherman would tell you, we're going to have a bit of weather, and then the next day there'd be a news article on the damage that it had caused, and that would be it. It would be all over. But now there's a build-up of media coverage for days leading up to what turns out to be an unremarkable storm. And here in the UK, something which I have never seen before, they've now started to give the storms names. Just to hype it up a little bit more. Last week we had Storm Kira. This week it's been Storm Dennis. I mean, how ridiculous. And even there seems to be an air of political correctness working its way into this elaborate weave of whatever it is. First storm had a lady's name, the second storm had a man's name, so presumably the next storm is going to be, I don't know, very windy Wendy, followed by a spot of cold weather perhaps that they'll call terribly chilly Charlie. I don't know, the whole thing to me just seems to be getting really silly and out of hand. Everything seems to be getting hyped up in order to reinforce some sort of story. We're all conditioned through life to believe that science is empirically correct, and that we can take whatever they tell us to the bank. But I think as you get older, certainly by the time you reach your 40s, you start to realise that science is actually very flawed. I remember as a kid hearing about global warming for the very first time, and I remember being told that this was because we were cutting the Amazon rainforests down. These were ancient forests that had been there for thousands of years. They were the lungs of the planet, and that if we cut them down beyond a certain point, basically we were all going to die, because it had taken hundreds of thousands of years for these forests to establish themselves, and we would never get them back. And then, about 10 years ago, it was discovered by archaeologists and historians that actually the Amazon rainforest is no more than about 500 years old. And we do have historical records from, I think it was Spanish explorers, who recorded that there was actually very little in the way of forest there some 600 or 700 years ago. And this information has been available all the time, but the scientific community refused to accept it. And it's only as deforestation has taken place and archaeologists have started to discover these various cities and settlements that the true facts have been established, and that what science was telling us actually wasn't true. Now, I'm not saying that it's right that we should be cutting the Amazon rainforest down. What I'm saying is that the information that's been fed to us by the scientific world was incorrect. It couldn't have been more wrong. And I believe that now the theory is that phytoplankton in the oceans are actually the lungs of the planet. There's a bit of a difference there. But I think the crux of this example is that the mainstay of the scientific community, even when the evidence was presented to them that they were wrong, they poo-pooed it for decades and refused to accept it as being the truth, until basically they were slapped in the face with it. I mean, it seems to me that they sort of make something up, they come up with a theory, if it sticks and other people accept it, they run with it, and once that theory is established, everyone refuses to let go of it. We've got this whole hockey stick graph debacle that went on a few years ago, where eminent scientists of the world came up with this graph which demonstrated just how bad global warming is, and how remarkably it is increasing because of our actions, and how that correlates with our activity on the Earth. This, I might add, is the basis on which governments are acting. It was accepted as being absolutely correct. It truly demonstrated that global warming is a thing and that it's caused by man. But it relied on historical data going back hundreds of years that actually doesn't exist. We don't have that information. So what they did is they just made it up. And they made it up based on what they expected it would have been if their theory is correct. So it was a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, it took some years, but other scientists realised the flaw in how this graph had been put together, and a huge controversy battled on for years, where at first the proponents of this graph maintained that it was absolutely correct until it was proven to them that it wasn't. So they then went through a process of constantly changing it, but each time, it still came out with the same results that the incorrect data had produced. How can that be? I don't understand that. And it certainly seems to me to be a case of, the information is correct depending on who and how many people are standing behind it compared to who are contesting it. That's not science, that's politics, surely. Now, it seems that there's dozens of examples of this sort of behaviour and inaccuracies that calls the whole thing into question. And in order to get to the truth, obviously, the thing to do is research to find out what the true facts and figures are, but they're not really available. What I mean is there are sort of three factions. There's the faction that says that global warming is a thing, it's going to kill the world, man is the cause of it, and we need to do something about it. And these are the people that advise the government and the media. There's another faction that says, yep, global warming is a thing and man is the cause of it, but actually, in the greater scheme of things, it's not going to make much difference. The world will adapt. It's been through changes far worse than this many times in its history. It's basically a storm in a teacup. And there's a third faction that says basically global warming doesn't exist. For every bit of information or scientific fact that the scientists put to us to prove it, there is an equal and opposite amount of evidence that proves it's not the case. I think one example that I read was a NASA study where, obviously we're told that the ice caps are melting and polar bears are dying and it's going to cause sea level rises, etc. Which, it might be true, I don't know. But NASA's monitoring the situation on the ice caps for the last 35 years apparently has revealed that yes, in some areas the ice is melting at a rate that we've not seen before, but then we've not been here that long. But on the other hand, ice is growing in other areas and the sort of square mileage of the ice caps hasn't altered in 35 years. So which one do we believe? And that's where the difficulty lies in actually finding out what the problem is, if there is a problem at all, because each faction tends to skew each article that they produce or report that they produce in a way that supports their argument. Now, my understanding of science is that it creates a set of facts which don't change, and those facts are relevant across the board. They don't alter according to what your view is. But what I did glean from it, a sort of common denominators that keep coming up, are this. Fossil fuel burning vehicles worldwide account for 6% of greenhouse gases expelled into the atmosphere. Now, in the States, apparently it accounts for 30%, so obviously they're using part of everyone else's quota of that international 6%. So theoretically, in the UK and Europe, we're producing far less than 6% through fossil burning motor vehicles. Now, I haven't been able to find a report that breaks down what motor vehicles produce what percentage, so from that I would presume that means shipping, aircraft, goods vehicles, as well as cars and motorcycles. Now, as far as I'm aware, this restriction, this zero emissions vehicle thing, isn't going to apply to aircraft, shipping, or heavy goods vehicles. It's just going to be the likes of cars, motorcycles, and light vans. So that percentage must shrink even further. By how much, I don't know, because no one makes that clear. Now, over the years, I've tried several times to get to the bottom of this, and each time I've come away equally as confused. But over the last year, one thing I have noticed creeping in to a lot of these reports and articles is population. Now, they say that modern man, Homo sapien, appeared on the Earth round about 200,000 years ago that we know of. And in around 1800, we reached a population of 1 billion people. That's worldwide, obviously. So it took 200,000 years for us to reach a population of 1 billion. By 1900, that's only 100 years later, we'd reached a population of 2 billion. And just over 100 years later, present day, we're at 7 billion. And I think the current prediction is that we will reach 10 billion people by 2050. Now, overpopulation seems to be a bit of a dirty word. But if you look at the portrayed percentages of what greenhouse gases are produced in what quantities by what causes, the largest at around 70%, give or take a few percent depending which report you're reading. The source of those greenhouse gases, that's methane and carbon dioxide, is described as being produced by natural processes. In some reports it refers to it as being produced by livestock. That is the bulk of the greenhouse gases being produced that are purportedly causing global warming. And some people are tentatively, because it's not a popular subject, suggesting that it's actually overpopulation that is causing global warming. Okay, the burning of fossil fuels certainly is not helping, but the whole thing is a vicious circle. The more people you have, the more food they require. And one report that I read said that animal agriculture, that is the breeding of animals for human consumption, represents 42% of all greenhouse gases produced worldwide. That's a huge figure. And I think it pointed out that your average human being during his or her lifetime consumes something like 8,000 animals. So obviously there has to be a huge infrastructure there producing those animals for us to consume, whether it be, a shrimp or a prawn or a cow. They all produce greenhouse gases, and they are all only there because we need to have them there in order to eat them. And then you've got 7 billion of us producing the same gases, which pushes that figure up further. And that is before you take into account our pets, dogs, cats, horses, and the general wildlife that has a right to be there anyway. And this apparently comes up to about 72%, 70%, something like that. Then you've got the 6% motor vehicles, and the rest is accounted for by industry, production of electricity, which is mainly fossil fueled even today. Forest fires, the list goes on, but I think, the big takeaway from all this is that the problem is not motor vehicles, the problem is the amount of people and the greenhouse gas producing infrastructure that is required to support all those people, and that is only going to rise. And of course, the more people there are, the more land needs to be cleared to provide housing for them. The more greenhouse gases have to be produced building that housing and putting an infrastructure in place for them to be able to live there. So when you take all this into account, taking the petrol engine away from the car driver and the motorcycle driver is going to make such an insignificant difference. The way I see it is that it's like putting a man on the Titanic a minute before it sinks, giving him a teacup and telling him to bail it out. It's an exercise in political correctness. It is not an exercise in actually trying to tackle global warming, or at least it doesn't look that way to me. Now, once we're all riding around on our electric bikes and driving our electric cars, there's a big problem that hasn't been solved yet. You need an input of electricity to charge the batteries in order to make them run. And the vast amount of that power produced globally is still produced, yeah, you've guessed it, by the burning of fossil fuels. So it's still not going to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases produced by that much. Now, in his proposal, Boris Johnson suggested that hydrogen cell fueled vehicles are the way ahead. And if you're not familiar with this technology, the hydrogen cell is used to generate electricity that drives the vehicle. Hydrogen is one of the most abundant gases in the world, so it makes an awful lot of sense, but there's a problem. Extracting and storing hydrogen gas is extremely difficult, so it is very expensive. And despite the fact that science has been working on this problem for 30 years, they're yet to make a major breakthrough into how to actually get that hydrogen gas for us to use. And bringing the deadline forward by 5 years, possibly 10 years, is giving the industry and science even less time to perfect that technology. So it looks to me like it's going to be cars and bikes that have to be charged up. Now, again, they've been working on these vehicles for 15, 20 years, and they still haven't made any major breakthroughs in how to make them more convenient. In most cases, you get a couple of 100 miles runtime, and then you're looking at hours of charging it up. And despite the government telling us for the last couple of decades that this is the way ahead, I've yet to see any real infrastructure for vehicle charging to be put in place. I mean, complaints are abundant that there still aren't enough charge points for the small amount of electrical vehicles that are already on our roads. Now, the government argues that range isn't going to be a problem because most people only take small, short journeys. But what about people that don't? What about people that travel long distances for work? What are they going to do? And what really does this mean for the motorcyclist? Well, motorcycles are considered an instrument of pleasure, not an instrument of necessity. And generally speaking, motorcycle manufacturers don't have the same kind of money at their disposal for research and development that car manufacturers do. And although the likes of probably Honda and Kawasaki are going to have the money there to develop something worthwhile, I think we're going to see a lot of the motorcycle manufacturers that we know today fall by the wayside and disappear. Then we've got the cost of electric vehicles. The industry says that electric vehicles on average cost the consumer around 30% more to buy. So the initial purchase of an electric vehicle is going to be more expensive. The government says that's going to be offset because electricity is cheaper, so it's going to cost them less to run them. Well, it's going to be a free market. Whichever way that electricity is supplied is going to be a free market, and the industry that's supplying it is going to want to make as much profit as it possibly can. So I'm quite happy that within a couple of years of all these changes taking place, it's going to cost as much to refuel your car with electricity as it is with petrol. I suppose what a lot of people have probably got in mind is that they'll look after the petrol driven bikes that they have, because they'll be able to keep them and still run them after the ban. This ban only applies to the sale of new vehicles from a certain date. Or you could buy a new petrol bike just before the cut-off point, which you would probably get for a bargain because the manufacturers will want rid of them. But we're presuming here, A, the government will honour that premise, if you like, and that they're not going to turn around 2 years after the ban and say, actually, from a certain date, we're taking all petrol-driven bikes and cars off the road. You can't keep them any longer. That's a distinct possibility. And the other problem, of course, is going to be availability of petrol, because as demand goes down for petrol, fewer places are going to stock it for us to fill our bikes up with. And those that do stock it are obviously going to put their prices up substantially because they're selling less of it. So this is one of those stories to which there doesn't appear to be any silver lining. Now, don't just take my word for what I've told you in this video. What I'm hoping more than anything else is that people will start to look into it. Certainly the way it appears to me is that, you know, the banning of petrol and diesel driven motorcycles and cars is an exercise in political correctness. There is nothing that the governments of the world can do about population. You can't start culling people when they reach a certain age because that's illegal. It's a crime against humanity. You can't start to dictate how many children people have or whether they're entitled to have children at all, because that's an infringement of people's civil rights. And it's been proven in any case that it doesn't work in countries where it has been tried. And you can't demand to the world that the population all become vegetarian, something which actually I think would make a huge difference to the problem. Because once again, internationally, that would be an offence against humanity. You can't dictate to people what they eat. So whether it's true or not, whether global warming is a thing or not, whether it's dangerous or not, the politicians and the scientific community have created this huge debacle, and they've now got to be seen to do something about it. And the only political correct action that they can possibly take is to remove the petrol and diesel engine from the common man, the man in the street. Even though on the face of it, it's not going to make any difference to this problem whatsoever if this problem does exist. Whether you're a car driver or a motorcyclist, this is a huge issue that is going to have a huge impact, not just on your lives, but on the lives of your children and every generation that follows. As it stands at the moment, if you try to research this whole subject, you will not find any definitive answers. If you have a particular opinion, you will find an answer that fits your opinion. But if you go into it with an open mind, looking for the ultimate answer, whether this problem exists or not, you will not find it. And I do think it's time that the governments of this world stand up and be counted, as well as the scientific community. I personally would like to see some fewer grey areas and far more black and white facts as to what the scenario actually is that we're dealing with, because it's not clear at the moment. And I think that the powers that be, instead of making decisions over our heads, need to be providing us with clear, honest and indisputable proof before any sanctions like this come into force. One thing that keeps popping up in these reports is that they keep telling us that we only have a decade of oil left before it runs out. And this seems to be one of the reasons that they're telling us we need to make this change. They've been telling us this since the 1970s. So I'm going to take that with a pinch of salt. What I really want people to do is give me some input. I would like to see a cross-section of views on this subject. All I ask is that you refrain from bad language, you keep it polite, and you keep it respectful. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my videos and support this channel. I'm hoping that this video has provoked thought and, you know, hopefully will cause people just to take stock of what is happening rather than just blindly accepting it. If you've enjoyed this video and you've found it useful, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you are subscribed, please click on the notification button so that you will be informed of any future video uploads. I will, of course, be back on Friday, so until then, ride safely, and I'll see you soon.